You are listening to The Only Constant, a podcast where we go beyond the usual discussions in technology and business and aim to explore more than explain. Join me for engaging discussions with a diverse range of global thought leaders as we seek to uncover new perspectives and insights in a free-flowing conversation. My guest today is Scott Newton, and I am your host, Lasse Rindom. Hi, Scott. It's really exciting to have you on The Only Constant, and I've been really looking forward to doing this episode with you. Welcome.
Hey, good morning, and thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be here.
Cool. Scott, you work in strategy and you post a lot of posts on LinkedIn about strategy content for global enterprises in general. And I just want to ask you, can we agree there's a strategic deficit in the AI market right now?
Well, the short answer is yes. And the longer answer to this, and where I see, Lassie, the big challenge is that we don't have a common definition of what strategy is, far less what AI is. And so we have confusion on top of confusion. And this is leading to expectations that cannot be met and decisions being taken that are not aligned with where organizations actually want to go.
But you say that, strategy matters all the time. Isn't that your catchphrase in the end of your posts all the time?
Yeah, I say strategy is mastery.
It's mastery,
And,
exactly, yeah.
and I mean, what I mean by that is strategy is all about taking decisions and then actually ensuring those decisions are acted on so that we have an outcome that is different from where we are today. But what we see in organizations is there's a lot of talk about strategy, there's a lot of PowerPoint slides and Excel worksheets, but that doesn't actually translate into meaningful, consistent action that then drives improved performance or different performance. And so when I say strategy is mastery, it's one, getting people to agree on what strategy is, and then
Mm.
two, really thinking about outcomes and how we're going to ensure that those outcomes actually change where we are today. Because the flip side is we're going to take a bunch of actions, they're not going to be coordinated, and what we end up with is a bigger mess than where we started.
But sometimes isn't the biggest problem in strategic thinking that you need to the prerequisite before you have a strategy. So you're talking a lot about implementing the strategy, following up on it, measuring it, but what about I always think that maybe that's just me, but I always think that the work done prior, the analysis, the identification of challenges is by far the most challenging part of it.
In my experience, in most organizations, there is someone somewhere that knows what the issues are. Now, that information might not be getting to the board. Even management might be hiding it or moving it away because it's inconvenient.
Mm.
But generally, in organizations, people do know. And not only do they know, but they have ideas of how it could be fixed. The problem is that those might be disruptive to the way the business is currently being run. And so people put that aside or say, I don't want to look at that, or there's not enough psychological safety in the boardroom for people to actually just come out and say, wait a minute, what's going on? And I'll give a very simple example. If we look at the great financial crisis, when there was an inquest by the British government on why they had to bail out RBS, which was the biggest bailout of a bank in the history of the United Kingdom, what it came down to was that board members were not psychologically safe enough to ask the question, what do these derivatives mean? So super smart engineers would come into the room and they'd say, hey, here is this massive block of derivatives and we're trading. And people would just nod their heads and say, well, that sounds good, without asking the question, well, wait a minute, what does this mean in terms of the future viability of our business? So when we don't have this psychological safety, we end up not asking the questions. And that's particularly relevant today when we talk about strategic deficits in AI, because very few people have even agreed on what AI actually means. And I'll argue we're really talking about machine learning, not AI. Uh, However, because we don't even have a definition of what it is, people are not speaking up and saying, wait a minute, how is this driving better business outcomes and what are the risks involved?
Yeah, but that actually means there's twofold to this, right? I always say, and obviously I work as a consultant for on AI, so I'm driving that discussion with customers and also implementing projects. So I'm very fond of the technology, obviously also the generative AI technology. But there's a lot of people don't even know they had a problem that they needed generative AI for right now in the first place, and at the same time, most of the marketing and a big focus is around productivity tools that you can put up an API for. No, KPI for, right? So this, how do we even measure? Oh, we've gotten better. Have we? Do we know what? How did we get better? Or you will become a better employee, a person if you use this, but what if I don't? Then it's on me, right? Then it's just my problem, right? So,
Yeah, well, there's a group I belong to actually based in the Nordics, Boards Impact Forum, and we have regular discussions with boards and chairs on what are the impacts of AI on strategy, on business, on board governance. And I think the real recognition that everyone's coming to, not only in that organization but around the world, is that it's very early days for AI. So if I
mm,
think back, I was speaking with an expert on AI this morning. 1999, incomes.com. And everybody started to call everything .com.
mhm.
So there was pets.com, and it was a kind of madness where you had these experts predicting there will be no retail shops in 10 years. Any industry that's not .com will go bankrupt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These very sweeping predictions. I think we're at the same place with AI. So
Why
when
do we
I
keep
think,
repeating? Why do we keep
yeah,
repeating?
yeah,
What is
yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah. Well, when I look at machine learning, it's a very powerful tool. It's not a particularly new tool in terms of organizations started with RPA or robotic process automation in the 1970s, and then from there it has continued to get better and better. Where I think there's been this big jump all of a sudden is in the interface with the user. So until recently, to program machine learning was fairly onerous in terms of you had to know a lot about systems and math, and now all of a sudden you can just have a conversation with a computer and say like, hey, what about this, what about that? And so we're opening this technology up to a wider number of users. Over time, the smartest companies and the smartest customers are going to figure out new business models, new ways to work, really improving productivity and ultimately
Mm.
solving big problems. Today, a lot of the use cases I see are marginal. And as you said, it's because we're chasing a KPI where we want to show 700 people less, we did the same job, etc., without really going back to what is the customer pain point and how do we make it better.
Yeah, exactly. So looking at the problem, and I think actually it is um, there's a solution statement out there, solution for things, right? They often become very generic. I think in the big marketing sense, you can do blah blah and blah blah, and it's just very generic statements, customer service, IT support, stuff like that. But I think it takes time for this to sort of settle down and get crystallized out into actual business problems and use cases and what we want to do with it. So it's easy to say this is just a productivity tool, just like saying here's Excel, right? The problem was that Excel replaced a spreadsheet, a physical spreadsheet to some extent. What does a chatbot really replace? I think that's there's a tech that's sort of outgrown our imagination, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, if I look back to all those pictures from the 1970s and CAD CAM engineering, and Boeing and these big companies would have massive studios filled with draftsmen
Mm,
literally drawing things using slide rulers and calculations. And then along came this software called CAD CAM, and you saw the same predictions that in 10 years no one will be working in CAD CAM and engineers are all going to be unemployed, et cetera, et cetera. And then we saw the reality was the opposite. There are more CAD CAM engineers today than there were in the 1970s.
mm,
Uh, why? Well, because we unleashed a technology that can change the world. So now you have mold makers, toolers, all sorts of industries and organizations that didn't exist or had very high barriers to entry are opened up to everyone. And that's made for some really cool innovations The same thing's going to happen with machine learning and AGI and whatever comes next, because there will be a next.
Yeah, there'll always be a next, but there's also going to be some kind of, I like to say that this everything we do with technology works on humans, right? And Shale also said that in his final note, that silicon needs carbon, right? And to me, there's a what do you call it? A slowness to this, a drag on this, right? The human drag to some extent. People will have this weird feeling of revolution because the technology came out, and then here 1.5 years after the emergence of generative AI, we're still seeing very few impacts in everyone's lives, right? It's very it's not like I'm not speaking to my fridge yet. Maybe I will be soon, but you get where I'm going. So I wanted to ask you about some of the dimensions of this strategic deficit, and you already said that it's going to take time for people to understand why does it take time. I think that's the interesting question.
Well, I mean, the human mind is an incredible thing, and it never ceases to amaze me, the innovation that is capable in our brains. But the innovation happens when people recognize both a problem and then a potential solution. So, looking through some of your earlier episodes of the program, which I really enjoy, that when the wheel was invented, it wasn't like the next day everybody just said, "Oh, let's start using wheels." And I mean, it takes a lot of time, and then all of the sudden, there is a point where, boom, just everyone uses the wheel. And let's think about computers. It
Mm,
was the same thing, that computers at first were used predominantly for accounting, military uses, and it was only much later that that technology started to come into the home and ultimately into our hands. And
mm,
Lord forbid, but it's where we're going, is into our brains. I've seen these new tools of putting computer chips into the brain. So, I mean, why does it take time? It takes time because we have to understand both the problem, where often we don't see that, and then experiment with different solutions until we get to something that's really meaningful.
mm,
Now, a lot of the integrations I've seen today with machine learning are not very elegant. And what I mean for that by that is that we're using a hammer when we need a paintbrush.
mm.
And that I keep seeing these examples. I did this with an LLM. I did this with an LLM, large learning model like ChatGPT. And you're like, yeah, you did. However, you could have done it with something that used 98% less energy and is 20% more accurate. So there's also that of experimenting until we find the equilibrium of technology and solution.
I love that because just the other day we were building a solution in with my team where we were asking an LLM to categorize invoice lines based on a mapping table that we gave it in the system prompt. So and sometimes, not very often actually, but very seldomly, it would hallucinate something else that wasn't in the mapping table. And what I initially said, well, let's have it rerun again and again, right? Or check up if it make another agent that checks up if it made a mistake, until someone just said we could also just put the mapping table in and said if the output is not in the mapping table, then it probably erred, and let's put it out for manual or make it do that again. So not have multiple agents evaluating, but just make it produce, evaluate with a simple look up in the table, and then move on. But sometimes you want everything to be LLMs. It's actually, I'm a little bit embarrassed by that, but it's because I always say the opposite, right? That we should look at when we have unlimited technology, like I actually think to some extent we have now. I think for me, the big mind stretch with generative AI is that we can work with unstructured data. I've said that a couple of times also on the podcast, which is something completely novel. I think actually that way we can actually do everything. So we should not focus on the technology anymore. We should focus much more on the problem, because whatever problem we have, there is a higher possibility that we'll be able to solve it with technology. Simply.
Yeah, I mean, the unstructured data element is very exciting.
Mm,
And again, I think the access to a much wider variety of people now is even more exciting. So the fact that anyone can have a free account or a $20 a month account and start experimenting with this technology is really cool. Uh, when we take that into companies, my caution is be sure that the experimentation we're doing is linked back to actual business problems. So I've seen too many cases of, and this comes back to where we have a strategic deficit. We're doing this because it's super cool,
mm,
which is fun. And if you want to do that on the weekend, go for it. As opposed to we're doing this because we know our customer has this problem and it's our biggest strategic priority to fix it. So it's that connection. And I'm not saying eliminate experimentation because experimentation is wonderful, but frame it around what are the customer challenges and come back to Christensen's early work on jobs to be done. What
mm.
is the customer actually wanting to achieve?
But this is Scott, this is terribly boring, right? You're saying we should incrementally look at the challenges we already have in the existing base of what we do in the business, right? Or what we're already doing. Isn't this, what about revolutions, right? What about disruption? I always, and can a company even prepare themselves not to be disrupted? Is that even possible? I've been thinking a lot about that actually.
Well, what I think a company can do is learn about and invest in where technology is going next. And if we take an example of this, Condé Nast is one of the biggest publishers in the Western world. They have magazines like Vogue that are really well known. Uh, about 8 years ago, they made a little publicized investment in a company in the United States called Reddit.
Mm.
And at the time, it was tiny money for them. They're a multi-billion-dollar organization, and the investment was $8 million. So it was like nothing. But they followed this investment and they worked on it. And as we know, this week they quoted it, and their share of the business is now worth $2 billion.
That's a good
And
story, but the Yahoo story in Google, right? That's a bad story, isn't it?
and this is where I think companies need to learn. So the Google story, I would always think about is why didn't the Yellow Pages buy Google? I mean,
Mm.
that would have been such a natural. And there are many reasons why not, but that's back to competing incentives.
Blockbuster, Netflix, so on, right?
Well, yeah, I want to come back to something you said though about incremental versus breakthrough thinking, and because I'm not advocating for incremental thinking as much as I'm advocating for truly understanding your customer job to be done. And your customer job to be done is not the way you're delivering on things today. It's, what is the fundamental need that that customer wants to have fulfilled? And when I can understand that, then I can start thinking about entirely new ways of solving that. And if we look at the fintechs, they're so good right now at disrupting the banks because the banks are looking inwards, saying, what have we done for the last 700 years?
Mm.
And how do we keep doing that? Right. And there have been very few innovations in banking since the Medicis. Uh, Meanwhile, in come the fintechs and say, you know, my customer actually doesn't care about bank. My customer cares about how do they send money to their supplier in India, or how can they share investments with their grandchildren. And those are things that fintechs are very good at solving. And up until today, banks have been highly resistant to
Mm.
because it challenges their core business model.
Yeah, yeah. But it just for me, it's just about. It's easy to see in hindsight what you should have done, right? And say, "Oh, you were disrupted because you were silly," or something like that. But I always imagine Yahoo being pitched tons of ideas. I always imagine Blockbuster being pitched tons of ideas, and they can't just go on everything, right? They have to say, "Okay, this doesn't make. We have a core business that's working. We know the market." So disruption is something, you have something that's working for you. There's always this. I think what we need to be aware of is not disregarding the existing customer base and what is actually working well for companies. There's always this, oh, this technology will have impact and ruin your business, or this technology, this and that. I've just seen so many times you come to a company with a technology saying this will transform you as a company, but in that sentence, there's always like a big disregard for what's actually working. And I think that bridge what's working with what could make something different, right? You have the customers you have now, the customers you might have in the future you don't have. Do you get what I'm getting at? I think there's the existing fabric is not just something you change around all the time. And sometimes big organizations have a logic to them because they have a banks. It's a different thing maybe, but there's a logic to it, right? There's also regulations on bank. Not a lot of industries are as regulated as banks are.
True. And here we come to the core of where technology and incentives are misaligned. And so let's take a look at the automotive industry. So the legacy automotive players in the United States, GM, Ford, and Stellantis, which is known as Chrysler in the US, um, they know what they need to do, uh, but they have a few barriers that are stopping them from actually doing that. And so one of those barriers we could highlight is the regulation that the big OEM are not allowed to sell directly to end users in the United States by law. And it's a law that goes back almost a century, and there's no changing that law. And so that's why they've been stuck in we need these dealers,
Mm,
etc. And of course, if I'm a dealer, most of my money comes from repairs to cars, mechanical repairs.
mm,
So an electric vehicle that has no complexity and doesn't require repairs is clearly not in my best interest to be selling. I mean, I won't have a business model in the future. And as Tesla has proven so well, I don't actually even need a dealership to sell an electric vehicle. So I can just do it online and have delivery centers, which are infinitely less expensive and don't require these massive inventories to be built up all over the United States. That being said, if I'm a dealer and some of these dealers are billion-dollar businesses employing thousands of people, I'm not going to embrace this. So we know what to do. We don't know how to do it, is part of what the issue is. And I think in many big companies, there has to be a way to confront this and say, how do we really disrupt ourselves? And doing so could significantly disrupt our shareholders. I mean, and a question to think about, what should Disney do now? Disney's been in a lot of trouble for a number of years. They fired the CEO. The old CEO came back from retirement. There's activist investors involved. I mean, here is a century old company that is loved in 97% of the world. What should they do next?
but they are still, hugely successful. They're just not growing at
Well,
the rate they should be, right?
yeah.
but
Well, go ahead.
but for me, there's this. I think it was someone at IBM who once said, maybe God built the world in 7 days, but he didn't have an installed base, and and that's one of my favorite quotes, right? Because it's difficult, right? And that leads me back to the technology discussion. Is that technology hype at least tends to treat the world or everything as greenfield. Just let's just go crazy. There's nothing there. Let's just pretend that we can do whatever we want. But in reality, is that whenever something becomes a thing, it becomes complex. It ends up having regulations. It has different entities and mother companies, daughter companies, affiliates. It has vendors. It has customers in multiple sizes. Things become complex. There's not just an enterprise architecture to change, but there is a societal impact, and there's a cross-company architecture to change, and that's difficult, right? That's just my point. Is that uh, and maybe that's just something I'm trying to do, is trying to teach myself, because I come from a technology perspective all the time, from a hype market. I present hype technology to customers. I try to teach myself always to have respect for what's actually working. So it's something like, as a mantra, almost saying, no, this company is doing something right. That's the only reason they can call me out and pay me money to do things, because they're doing something right, and I need to know what they're doing right to understand what they could be doing better, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things there that I hit on. One is ecosystems.
Mm,
So understanding what role does the company play in the overall ecosystem, and how can they change that in ways that are positive. And then the second is where can technology really make a positive impact on the lives of our employees, our customers, our shareholders. And I go back to, what are the technologies, if tomorrow were taken away from me, I would be upset about?
mm,
So, what are the ones where I go, oh no, this is really an issue. What am I going to do to replace it? And I'll give you a simple example: Miro. right? So Miro became wildly popular during COVID because we all had to pretend we were in a room when we couldn't be in a room together. But organizations have continued to use Miro, and for example, in our firm, we use Miro quite a bit internally and with our clients uh, because it's such a good visual learning tool. So when technology works well, it's inserted into our lives to the point where we don't even notice it's there.
Hmm.
However, if we took it away, we would have a pain, and that pain would be something that we would look to replace, or seek to replace. And so it's balancing this and understanding. I keep going back to, I know it's repetitive, but it's, I see so many organizations miss it. What does the customer actually need as their job to be done?
Yeah, because it's
And
not really about the technology, right? It's about, the change of how it interacts with the rest of the things you have to do.
correct. Correct. The customer actually doesn't necessarily, well, some people do, but very few people care about the technology. They care
Mm.
about, can I do the job better, faster, cheaper, safer, more sustainably? Um, what are the ways to make that happen? And that's where I think technology gets really exciting. But it's not having software take notes for a meeting so I don't have to attend it, because that's called an email.
But it's so there's a lot of people asking enterprise right now to build AI strategies, right? You need to have an AI strategy, and I think I actually said something, you know, mm, along the same routes a couple of months ago. But I'm actually starting to say, no, you don't need that. Do we need an AI strategy?
Well, yes and no. So, um, does it have to be called AI strategy? No.
Mm,
Do you need to consider how machine learning and new technologies are going to impact your strategy? Yes.
mm,
And if you're not able to do that without calling it out, then call it out. But I mean, there are so many things in the world that impact our strategy, and technology is a big one.
mm.
So you need to continually be saying, what could technology do? Have people in your organization actually experimenting with technology within safe boundaries, but so that you can be learning, what could be different. Uh, what have we not thought about, and who might use this to do something better than we are?
But it becomes something, a strategic thing is a long term thing, right? So if you look, a company is looking like in 3 years we must have done something great with AI. That's an AI strategy, isn't it? I just think there's something that's why I've stopped asking for it, because I think there's something wrong with that we must do something great with this technology. Well, not if it doesn't make any difference to you. You don't have to, right?
Yes. I mean, if the technology doesn't make any difference to your business, then why would you add it in? At the same time, I would encourage every company to have a small team of people experimenting,
Yeah, yeah, all the time.
without any boundaries, but really pushing technology to the edges and
Mm,
saying, what could we do with this? And thinking differently, because obviously, if you ask people in the yellow pages, do we want to buy Google? No, because we're a printing company, and so our KPI is how many pages do we print,
mm,
and Google's going to make us print less pages. So this is not a good deal. However, if you'd ask, customers, why do you have the yellow pages? Their answer is, because I need to find a
yeah.
restaurant, a dentist, a dry cleaner. And then all of a sudden, we start to have a different answer to that question. So, what I've found works really well with boards is to start breaking your business into core, growth, and explore portfolios of business models. And importantly, your KPIs for those are different.
Mm,
Because if we use the same KPIs, then we're always going to end up showing our core business model wins,
mm,
because we've optimized that.
yeah.
Uh, so it's looking at those differently. And then the last point I'd add on that is killing the explore models when we see that they don't work. So not carrying on with them just because they're pretty or trendy or cool, but just saying, hey, look, that didn't cut it. Put that away for now, and let's look at where we should be allocating our capital and our resources so that we can explore something else.
Yeah, yeah. Just like some of the examples that I have, is a lot of companies are dire need of adequate business intelligence or reporting, KPI reporting on what they're doing, so they can make the right decisions. But instead, they're saying, "Oh, we want to buy AI. We don't want to buy that right now. We want to buy something that's cool." And having that explorative, technology interested group is obviously important, but that's also an investment, to take away from something else maybe you should be investing in. And at the same time, consultants, like you and me, I think, are also, that's what we're here for, right? Giving them inspiration on what they could do with the different technology, right? They don't need do we need to put up teams to just look at this? Could just listen to consultants instead.
Yeah, well, as a consultant, this is I like to encourage companies not to use too many consultants, uh, and because
Interview
we
ends
need,
now.
yeah, you can edit that out, but because we need to build up capabilities internally,
Yeah,
right? And it has to be internal resources that are understanding what our customer needs are. So I heard some people I'm working with the other day, and they're working with four of the largest companies in America, and all four of these companies are using the same consultant. Um, and lo and behold, all four of these companies in different industries have exactly the same AI strategy with the same slide decks.
love
And
it.
yeah, it's very understandable. I get it.
Getting a
And we
cutting
can
edge
talk.
for billions of dollars. Yeah, I love
Yeah,
it.
but we can talk about scalability and margins and replicability. We all understand. Let's think, though, if all companies are following the same playbook, then we're all going the same way. And that's not experimentation. And that's not understanding our customer needs. That's following the so called best practices,
Yeah,
which won't give us those exceptional outcomes that our shareholders are looking for.
that's actually what's going to make, if you do that, you're going to make it all, just like SEO, right? Search engine optimization, which is the most crappy human endeavor ever, I think. It's making everyone the same, right? No one's going to get a cutting edge, but they're going to spend a lot of money on it. I also think to some extent that, that's crappy consulting, right? Providing the same framework for everyone, like you just said. I think that's someone should be ashamed of themselves, I think.
Yeah, I'm not going to speak badly
No,
about
no,
any
no, no, don't,
specific
no.
competitor, but I would say this is that, you know, every organization has its unique reason that it came into existence.
Exactly.
And now, how do we embrace that uniqueness and use it to take ourselves into the future? And that's where the discussion becomes really interesting and why we need internal people focused on this.
That I really, really love that you said that. One of my favorite quotes is always taking the Anna Karenina opening line. Every happy family is the same. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way.
Right.
And saying that, and every enterprise is unhappy. Every enterprise is not digital enough, or is not productive and not growing enough. Something, and they're all that way in their own way. And that, I think, that should be on the walls of that quote should be on the walls of every consulting firm in the whole world, right? Please treat your customers this way. Like,
Yeah. Uh, Excellent point. And here's the thing. I mean, I always read the case studies from HBS or other big suppliers on companies, and of course, every company in those sounds incredible. I mean, it's just they're firing on all cylinders. There's no innovation they haven't unturned. And then I'll invite people from those same organizations to come in and speak with executive learners I'm working with, and of course, when you start to look behind the cover, so to speak, it's not quite as pretty as the case presented it.
no,
And
it
so
never
every
is.
every organization has challenges, and even the best companies in the world, the ones that everybody wants to work for, have things that are not working well, and that's okay. I mean, that's it's back to the family example. There's no family, no matter how happy they are, that doesn't have something that they need to work through, and it's the
But
same with organizations.
if they're listed, right, they will never have some, I don't know, senior controller go out and talking about all the problems they have, right? That's just not gonna happen. So whatever you get marketing from is gonna look like they have everything fixed. But usually, my experience, no matter what big enterprise you go to, and they might have had data strategies, they're talking about how well it's going. No matter who you talk to, they'll have a master data problem and they'll have processes that are completely, unstructured, and no one's following them, and every single one of them, right? And but that's not the story in the media, right? That's just something you know when you talk to them, that everything is sort of. But that's also the beauty of it, I think. I think that's and the chaotic beauty of how humans actually organize themselves, because none of them would say that they don't work for this company, so that this is a company. They know they work for it. They know they do things that add to the whole, but they're all a little bit unsure about what's actually right now going on. What are they actually touching? The processes are undefined. The data is undefined. There's a lot of problems. There's some beauty in that. That's just what I'm saying. The chaotic beauty of it, the complex, chaotic beauty of it. Anyway, that might be a sidestep, but I think it's. I just wanted to say I agree with you. You hear these good stories, but then you just scratch the surface just a little bit, and you figure out things are not that way through and through, right?
Well, one thing I see is that when people come out of business school in particular, and I'm a business school graduate and I
Mm-hmm.
teach at business schools, and so I have my love and not love relationships with them. Uh, all this being said, people come out of business school and there's a kind of this expectation that you just get this big software system, it sits somewhere in a magical cloud, you push the button and everything runs automatically. And as we know, the reality is the cloud can be super expensive. It might have security concerns we need to worry about. It's not always 100% uptime. And by the way, you push the button and everything comes out, but it's all wrong. So it's balancing this. Where does technology really help our business? And where should we invest our resources? Because these are not inexpensive technologies. So I'm all for them as long as we can demonstrate they give us a return on investment that is better than competing alternatives.
Made me think about bringing up a child. What you just said, right? You when you don't have them, you're thinking, oh, it's going to be nice. We're just going to follow this way of doing it. We're going to bring them up like this, tuck them in at night at 8. Oh, and when they cry, we're gonna. But then reality hits you, and you have some of the same things you just said, right? Don't have the same uptime. I'm tired now. I just love that. Anyway, Richard Rommel says that we should look at proximate objectives when outlook is chaotic. And what is the proximate objective for companies right now looking at working with new technologies?
Yeah, it's a great quote and very thought provoking. So here's what I would say that organizations can do. Uh, when they're talking about technologies, don't necessarily look only at those short term KPIs, because I think they lead you to wrong decisions. And so, as we mentioned at the start of this podcast, there's a lot of emphasis on, oh, yeah, we're going to do 20% improvement in productivity. Well, the reality is, no, you're not. Or if you are driving that number, you're probably alienating a huge number of your customers. I mean, I saw an example recently with one of our clients. Their bank has gone to full AI customer service. So this corporate client has a problem. They register it in the portal, and the answer comes back. We have the AI technology. Unfortunately, your query didn't fit in the AI technology workflow. So it'll be 4 to 7 business days before someone will get back to you. And I just know there's someone in an office somewhere getting a bonus for hitting that target
Mm,
on efficiency. But we're not. I mean, they're going to lose a customer over this, and they probably won't lose just one. So to come back to your question, let's not look at the short term objectives, and rather think long term. What is the learning in our organization, and what competencies are we building?
mm,
So it's that building of long term capabilities and competencies that I would encourage organizations to be most measuring, and understanding how that will enable them to better serve their customer of the future. Think about Amazon, right? So Amazon, AWS, they started as a logistics company, if you really look at their
mm,
business, and they're very good at that. I mean, they're one of the better operators worldwide in logistics. But what they created is this incredible capability in technology. And if we look at their revenue streams, particularly in terms of net income, second to advertising is now technology sales.
mm,
So again, when you create these capabilities, you're opening up entire new business models and streams for the future. And you're not going to find that in short term KPIs. So, what should you be looking for long term? Learning. What are the learning capabilities in our organization, and how do we measure those relative to the future?
So keeping learning is the definite proximate objective for everything all the time. That was what you said, right?
Correct.
Cool. I completely agree with that, and I think it's an interesting perspective also that you have. Um, that you mentioned how they were, creating better, higher efficiency, but alienating the customer. Because I think that is exactly what people need to be very aware of right now. Is already a trending somewhere. The hashtag made by the human, also on LinkedIn, right? With content, LinkedIn is a different thing, right? But we're both on it, and you see all this AI generated stuff there. The enshittification or what you could call of content, but are you even looking at the customer you want to interact when you're doing that, or just pushing it out? What are you pushing out, right? That's the point. How can we? What is the purpose of it, right? That's back to what we've been speaking about this whole episode. The purpose of the technology. What do we want to achieve? Just want to have efficiency, or do we want to engage with people?
Yeah, well, in terms of content, this brings me back to the key question that the very first writing coach I worked with kept asking me, and she was really tough. And she just kept saying, "What do you want people to do when they read this?"
Mm,
And she kept coming back to it, and it's a hard question because then you look at what you've written, and you're like, "Oh, well, that's not very good." And she would just keep coming back to it. What do you want people to do? So now let's think about AGI generated content, which is proliferating media platforms, etc. It all looks the same. It all sounds the same. If you ask most readers, they can identify machine generated content compared to human content very quickly. And there's even now studies showing that people are filtering out
mm,
AGI generated content. So our minds see it and say, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to see that. And that'll just get better and better. Our brains are very good at pattern recognition. So, this being said, when you're writing content, what do you want people to do when they read it? Well,
mm.
if your content isn't standing out, then you're just another gray shirt in a world where our minds are searching for color.
Yeah, you still need to. I thought about this with the after seeing the Azure, the Copilot for Azure the other
Mhm.
day, which I thought was kind of cool because now you could just ask about consumption across all of your different deployments and subscriptions and everything. But then one of my friends said that but you still need to know how Azure works to ask
Right.
the Azure Copilot. It also will not make sense. You have to know what you want to do with it and what it can do. So you need to be an expert in Azure. And if you're an
Right.
expert in Azure, you might not need to ask a chatbot what you want to do. So, but that's the same thing, right? To make good content and to identify if what you've written is good content, you still need to be a good copywriter, right?
Yeah, you also you need to be unique. How do you
Yeah.
stand out? Why you? It's like you go to the super. I went to the supermarket the other day for an article I was writing, and I look. There's 122 different kinds of cola on the shelf. Generic cola, branded by
Mm,
the supermarket cola, Save the Trees cola, blah 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 blah. And then at the end of the aisle is Coca Cola with their red label and their cap, and it's more expensive than all the others, and it hasn't changed in 100 years. Everyone just goes and picks up the Coca Cola. There's no
mm,
negotiation. It's 70% market share. So their message clearly wasn't created with AGI to be like the other 120 brands, which the millions of SKUs. They have their unique look on the world. And for all of us that are creating content, how do we be the Coca Cola?
But let's just also zoom that one out, right? And say, so, because a lot of people are looking to replace their competencies, in-house competencies, with AI. But what I'm trying to say was actually that you need to keep your competent people and help them maybe instruct an AI so that other people in the company might tap into their expertise easier. But you still need the competencies because you can't just replace them. You need people to know what's good content, what's good outcome, what's good output from the models, right? You just need that.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. The models can do the banal lifting for us,
Mm,
which there are in organizations, hundreds of Excel jockeys
yeah.
that could be doing something that's much higher value add. And that's where technology to me gets really exciting. And I've seen an example, a company we're working with, they do software to optimize accounts payable,
Mm.
and they can take all that repetitive work that normally is full of errors and automate it, and in the process improve customer outcomes and take the people. You're not It's not like you're firing those people. You're saying, I don't need you anymore to do data entry. Rather, now let's look at how we can better serve our suppliers and our customers.
Yeah, do
And all
controlling
of a
instead.
sudden,
Yeah.
wow, here we are. We're now, and also for the employees, is so much more meaningful because nobody gets excited to go to work and say, "Today I'm going to do 3,000 lines of data entry." I
No,
mean, it's just no. It's
but
no.
that's the point, right? My point is just that that's been the thing for a long time, right? Also, I've seen so many people doing the same models and analysis in Excel over and over and over, and for years you've been able to lift shift that into a BI report instead of dashboard. But for some reason that doesn't happen. Excel just keeps on living, and to some extent, my fear could be that generative AI might end up being this unconcrete productivity tool like Excel, where everyone's just putting all the crap in instead of asking about the right solution for doing this. They'll just keep on asking, taking the stuff into it. I spoke to someone about the other day that you take your processes and put it into chatbots. You take your processes and data, put it into Excel, where we really need to put this logic that is in Excel and is in the chatbot into our systems and processes, so we don't have to do it again manually. That's the point, right? Taking the technology into our processes and systems, and doing that tedious work for instead of us taking it out all the time, right?
Well, that's what the risk always in digitizing processes, and this goes back to some of the early work I did on ERP. Why companies didn't get the return on investment they expected from ERP systems, because they took their old processes, digitized those, and then said, okay, now we're going to follow the same process we used before, but it's going to be on a mainframe
Yeah.
and or on the cloud or in a server, wherever it is. And I mean, this is the definition of insanity. Uh,
Mhm.
so instead, where you see the breakthrough organizations are the ones that start with a clean piece of paper and say, here's what we need to do for the customer. Here are the controls we might have that are legally required, regulated, security, etc. And now, how do we get from here to here?
Yeah, how
So,
we bridge that. Yeah, and that's the
how do we
difficult part. It's not easy. You can't just build the new stuff. You need to bridge all the people and the processes into a new setup, right? And that's really difficult. That's really difficult.
it is, but that's where digitization starts to deliver those breakthrough numbers that you see on LinkedIn.
So
So
breakthrough numbers, it's got Goldman Sachs saying 7% GDP growth from generative AI. So I just how that that's another point I wanted to discuss with you. What does it take for a global economy to gain 7% GDP growth from generative AI?
yeah, well, with all due respect to my esteemed colleagues at GS, they're always wrong on every prediction they've ever made. So they'll
That's a
probably
lot
be
of
wrong.
respect.
They'll be wrong here too. Um, what does it take to gain 7% GDP growth? Well, 7% GDP growth is not going to come from one thing alone. So, Gen AI can be a lever to get us to 7% GDP growth. But I think we need to look at what are the real barriers we have today to GDP growth. And most of those are not technology barriers.
Hmm.
So, now, could technology help us overcome some of those barriers? Absolutely. When I look at most organizations, though, there have been very few changes in their processes in 20 years.
Hmm.
And what this has led to is a flatlining of productivity. And we see that in Europe, we see that in the US, we're starting to see that in China. So all the major modern economies are flatlining in productivity. It's not because they don't have technology, it's because they're not looking at how to work differently. So, how do we get 7% GDP growth while we completely unlock the business models and the ecosystems? And let's take an organization that has done this. Uh, are you familiar with Hire, the Chinese company known for appliances?
No, I don't. I can't say I am. Sorry.
Okay. So Hire has also bought many brands. In the US, they bought GE Appliances, which is the largest appliance
Hmm.
manufacturer. In Europe, they bought Candy, which is quite well known, for example. Uh, but what they've done is they've said, look, bureaucracy kills companies. And so they've completely eliminated the traditional bureaucracy of organizations, and they have self forming teams. And those teams are funded much like a venture capital or private equity fund would work. So it's complete change in business model, etc. Now, people will say, "Oh, this is an example where they eliminated all bureaucracy and hierarchy." And but what you actually see at the center of Hire is an organization that has extraordinary technology capabilities that can support all of these teams. So can help them not need accounting systems, can help them not need logistics systems, can help them identify the best people around the world that could contribute to their projects, can change business models completely and bring in new actors into the ecosystem. So this is where all technology, including Gen AI, could give us massive breakthroughs on GDP because we're getting rid of that inefficiency and that waste. And look at any organization today. Just ask people in the organization, where's the waste? They're going to point you to it. And could AI help you with that?
Mm.
Absolutely. But how do we use the lever of technology to improve the performance of our people?
So not looking at people as the waste. I think that's a good thing, but looking more at the waste in your processes and your data and the way you're treating your customers the wrong way. Or like I I said to I had a course on AI last week where I said to a lot of communications people were on this course, copywriters, and I said maybe you shouldn't have it write content for you, but just have it review content to make sure you're not making people angry or you're hitting the spot. You're not escalating a situation, right? So solving some of the issues we know there is, some of the waste we know there is in our communication, instead of saying let's generate completely new content. That's sort of the same thing you're talking about, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I've been using Hemingway app, which is an editor that uses machine learning for years. And basically, you take your text, you post it into it, and it will tell you the readability level of your what you've generated. And that's really useful because when you get to too high of readability levels, people don't connect with it anymore. So there are many things, and it comes back to what you've said there. I like that. People are not the waste.
Mm,
It's the jobs we're giving people to do that are
yeah,
the waste. And they see that. I mean, you talk to people in the warehouse, they said, I've loaded up these containers. I know the materials inside them are defective. They've been shipped off to a supplier. The supplier's going to reject them and send them
yeah,
back to me. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to unload that container.
yeah.
Uh, this is the world. But it's not that those people are not effective. They just don't have the tools to change it.
So, I don't. I know I always ask my participants to prepare an only constant, but if you didn't, that could be it. Well, only constant is waste. There's always a waste to identify, right? We don't need to replace people or become cold psychopath organizations, but just look at all the waste that no one really cares about anyway, and let's try to eliminate that, right? Maybe that could
Absolutely.
be my own constant.
Well, and let's think about what is it that we're really wanting to accomplish.
Mm,
So coming back to basics in terms of how do I better serve my customer? How do I better serve my employee? How do I better serve my investor?
mm,
Uh, but always starting from that customer centric viewpoint. And I hear too few executives talking about the customer when they talk about
mm.
AGI.
Yeah,
Uh, they talk about what AGI can do and they talk about meetings but no customer pays you for the number of meetings you have.
no, no, that's a good point. That's a really good point. Um, Scott, last time we spoke about, or I mentioned the high level equilibrium trap, which is something I've studied history, so it's something I touched a little bit upon. And you told me just before this podcast that you sort of rabbit holed into that subject a little bit. So now I'm actually afraid you know more about it than I do. So that's brilliant. But I'm just wondering, high level equilibrium trap means that you're on a high level, so there's no need for you to innovate and become something different. While Europe became modern because we were crappy at being pre-modern, and China didn't become modern because China was actually quite good at being pre-modern. That's the core of it. Is generative AI a high-level equilibrium trap for the West, right? For the modern West, or for the industrialized world? We're so affluent, we're so comfortable in our processes and our data privacies and everything. I've seen some polls showing that people in Europe are very skeptical of AI and unsure of it and nervous about it, whereas people in, I think, India and Thailand, Malaysia were like super enthusiastic. Um, is this a thing? Is this a thing? Are we? Is this the disruption moment of the entire West, the high level equilibrium trap?
Yes and no. So definitely, even before AGI came around, we've seen that there is a level of comfort in wealthy Western societies that is limiting innovation to some
Mm,
degree. And I've been traveling and working in China for more than 20 years. And you know, one of the messages I always come back to Europe or America with is you need to go to China. And I'll hear executives and they'll tell me, "Oh, I know about China." And I say, "When was the last time you were in China?" And they'll say, "Well, I went for a 2 day conference in 2004 in Shanghai." And I said, "Well, there's more to China than China." I give them the example. Could you say you know the whole United States because you spent a weekend in Manhattan?
mm,
It's a pretty risky bet to think that. And it's the same with China. So, coming back to your question, we're very, very comfortable where we are, and we shouldn't be so comfortable. Let's look at the automotive industry right now and what's going on. So I wrote an article that got a huge amount of traction last week that compared the electric car sold in Europe by Fiat. It's 37,000 euros, and an almost identical car designed by the same Italian designers, ironically, that is sold in China for 11,000 euros. But the Chinese model, made by BYD, uh, who the key investors, Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett, the Chinese model actually has double the performance, double the range, less energy consumption, more space inside, and it's 11,000 euros. So we have significant disruption coming to our major industry as it is. And so, to some level, we may be already living in the high equilibrium trap,
mm,
and it's time to get out of it. I've heard politicians recently, I live in Italy, so big politicians saying we're going to protect workers from AI. And I'm wondering, first of all, I mean, why would you want to protect them and not help them? And
mm,
two, even if you wanted to do that, how could you? And we're sort of going there right now in the United States, where you know the two contenders for president are competing to see who can raise trade barriers and protectionism to the highest levels. Uh, Now, that may buy you some time. That could buy you 2, 3 years. Long term, however, it's like building a wall to stop the water. The water's going to come in.
mm,
It's going to come in, and so you cannot build an isolated society that will work in the long term. And this is where my concern is, and where I loved getting into the depth of the high equilibrium trap. We risk that by not looking at how we can improve our future, we are doomed to lower standards of living and lower quality of
yeah.
life. And we're seeing that to some degree. I mean, all this quantitative easing, surprise, surprise, has resulted in massive inflation,
Mm.
which simply lowers our quality of life.
Yeah, yeah, but I also think something I've seen in multiple places. Right, you had the U.S. making systems and democracies, liberal markets that sort of outcompete competed the old monarchies of Europe early on. But then suddenly you had a slowdown because they became um, they became high level trapped in their own way of thinking, while we in, for instance, Scandinavia were quite poor until 40, 50 years ago, most of the countries in Scandinavia. And then we sort of started saying, okay, let's make a welfare state where we give free education and unlock that potential, that human potential in education. And suddenly we became very wealthy. And now the US is sort of stuck in an industrial mindset, and high cost education systems, not unlocking that potential. So there's always this thing, when you're not doing well, you innovate to become better. So you have to do that. You're forced to innovate. And the places in the world right now that are forced to innovate are, China and India. I think also India is really important to keep close because India's going to innovate a lot. I'm quite sure as well, and it's a democracy. So a lot of these countries are forced to innovate because they have such mass populations that are still living relatively poor and need better schooling, better healthcare, all those things. And that's just a burning platform to innovate, and we don't have that. So we're sort of stuck with this is okay. The AI doctor is probably not going to come from the West, right? Because we have doctors.
Well, yeah. In fact, the if you look at telemedicine, the biggest breakthroughs have come in China, actually, where
Um,
they're relative to the population, there is a low number of doctors. Although, looking at the trends, I'm pretty worried for Europe on this front too. If we talk about
mm,
medical doctors, uh, let's come back to that, though. I mean, society needs to continue to innovate for us to maintain our standard of living, and even with that innovation, it's unlikely that our current standard of living can be maintained with a planet that is sustainable for everyone. Of course, this is a highly unpopular discussion for any politician
mm,
because you're never going to get elected by promising that the future generation is going to be worse off than you are. I mean, it's just impossible.
yeah,
So, if we truly believe that we want the future generation to be better off than we have been, then it means we have to innovate at a level that can make that possible. And standing still is not going to do that. We know there are enormous challenges today, ranging from energy to health to
yeah.
security. Uh, how are we going to tackle these challenges? Well, that will require incredible innovation. And yes, of course, we need technology because we need to do things much differently in the future than we do them today.
Yeah, but it's also, we have all these challenges, but so many of them are sort of, a little bit, they're not right in front of me. There's this, I can't see it. I can still travel anywhere. There's climate crisis. Everyone agrees. I can fly wherever I want to do tomorrow if I want to do that. There's no limits on me anyway, right? It's not really. In Denmark, we have a saying that Danish "nød lærer nøgen kvinde at spinde." That means that, sorry for the Danish, I didn't do any Danish before on the podcast, but actually means that when you're a naked woman who is in need will learn how to make clothes, right? To sew
Right.
and stuff like that. But if you're not naked and you're not cold, right? Why would you learn to make clothes, right? What's the point?
Yeah, well, that's a societal question. I
Mm,
guess it depends on if you believe what the numbers are telling us or you don't. If you do believe what the numbers are telling us, then we need to do something differently and with urgency. If you don't believe what the numbers are telling us, then fine. However, uh, there are not a lot of people saying those numbers are wrong.
no.
So, and the people that are saying those numbers are wrong are generally not with any scientific backgrounds at all. Or the entire global scientific community has got this wrong, or we need to change the way that we go about using resources that are increasingly scarce on the planet.
But it's telling,
Uh,
right, that the entire democracies of the West are not taking action on something everyone agrees on, isn't it? Taking aggressive action.
well,
That's a weird situation, isn't it? From a strategy, it must be weird from a strategy's perspective, right? Seeing that so much data. We're not going to talk environment, but anyway, so much data and no action taking on it.
well, I mean, people tend to again look short term rather than long term, and I mean a very simple example of this. If we look at the situation, the challenge in the Ukraine, it was very clear what Russia's plans were in 2014 when they annexed Crimea.
Mm.
I mean, it was not a secret anymore what they wanted to do, and yet for 8 years following that, we did nothing. Not only did we do nothing, we increased our reliance on Russian gas in Europe because it was cheap. And so, I mean, this is such an easy example. It was clear what Russia was going to do. it was clear that we were highly dependent on them, and yet we decided to become more dependent because we appreciated having an inexpensive lifestyle. So now, I mean, as The Economist calls it, the peace dividend. We've spent our peace dividend. Now we have to pay for it.
Yeah.
Uh, Look, I don't want to get too much into how does that
No, no.
happen, etc. But just to say that in strategy, just because we see what's coming doesn't mean we take the action to change it, even when it's an existential threat. And early in the discussion, you brought up Blockbuster. A lot of people tell the Blockbuster story, but what I find more interesting is the inside story on Blockbuster, which is that the board and management of Blockbuster knew that streaming was going to knock them out of the business. They had no doubt about it. They recorded this in board meetings. It's in minutes that are publicly available. They had a problem. They had franchisees.
Mm.
And the franchisees, of course, had spent a lot of money buying a Blockbuster franchise. And they said, no way am I going to let you do streaming. I'm going to sue you
Yeah.
and put you out of business. And so, even when the existential threat is clearly recognized, it doesn't mean that we always do things about it because we have barriers, limitations, legal obligations, contracts inside our own company. And so, for anyone that is looking at how they can use AI, machine learning, any technology, ask yourself, am I not making the change because I don't believe in it? Or am I not making the change because it's just politically easier not to?
Peace dividends. We have peace dividends. We have. I said, it's friction, right? Taking a stand against those franchisees, right? Is friction, and that's why change needs friction. It needs to touch something. It is difficult to change. It's not just a technology you throw at something, right? It is something we need to. It's hard work. That's the point again, right? I love to say friction right now. I have been saying that for a couple of weeks because I think it's an important word to bring back. That you might have a lot of speed, but that's just because you have no friction. And if you have no friction, you're not touching anything. So that's my that's my that's my sentence for hype market. Anyway,
Right.
but final question here, right? Can technology be a strategy if you're not a software vendor, Scott?
Fast answer, no. Slow. I mean, who is really doing well out of the current AGI boom? Well, it's the people selling the shovels, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So Nvidia has a. I can't believe it. If you look at their price to earnings ratios, um, they do very very well out of this. If you're not a software technology hardware vendor, technology cannot be a strategy by itself. It can be an extreme enabler. However, unless you're a technology company, no, you can't have technology as your strategy. You can have technology as the capability
Yeah.
that makes your company more competitive than anyone else in the market. Um, Absolutely. I mean, if I look at what Temu, which is known as Pinduoduo in China, has done to disrupt e-commerce markets, that's a technology play. But it's a technology play that connects to a very, very strong supplier base and an incredible logistics network. So
Mm.
they're not a technology company per se. They're using technology to connect suppliers and customers and take out all those intermediaries.
That's an awesome answer to that question. I love that, and it's a very clear answer as well. I think that's important in this market. But this also leads me, Scott, now to my absolutely final, question. This is the key piece. So hope you're ready for that. What is the only constant?
Yeah. My only constant is human ingenuity. And what I mean by that is our brains, our emotions, the way that we act are an incredible power and gift. And when we use that together with technology, we can do incredible things. But when we start to strip the human out and leave only the machine, we lose all the advantage we wanted to gain and build. And so, what I see today is more and more people putting trust in technology as opposed to continuing to use their human brain. And I'll give you the easiest example: Google Maps. There are now statistics in most countries of the number of people that get into very bad car accidents because they follow Google Maps into impossible positions. And there's an example in the UK of a woman who drove into a train yard, unlocked the gate, and drove into the middle of the tracks because that's what Google Maps told her to do. And I mean, what happened? Of course, she got hit by a train, which is terrible. I don't want to laugh about this because it's not funny. I saw a case in Italy where there was a car that was literally driving down the Spanish steps. Um, you know, how could you get? And they got a huge fine, and they damaged some archaeological treasures. How could you get into a position to do that? Well, somehow their map program had told them that was the best road to take. So this is now, we've abandoned the biggest gift we have in the world, which is our brains, and subordinated it to a machine that has no feelings, no comprehension. It's just making mathematical calculations. And that's why I always come back to it's not AI. We don't have AI as of yet. We have machine learning. And I sound like a little bit of a nerd because I keep saying this over and over again, but as soon as you start to use the words artificial intelligence, it implies that a machine has the same capabilities as a human, sentient intelligence. There is no machine that I'm aware of on the planet that has any version of sentient intelligence. We've built very, very good mechanical Turks. So, coming back to what's my point in all this, do not lose the beauty of humanity and the ingenuity of our brains, which are the difference between us and machines.
That's a really, really great answer, Scott. And it also encapsulates everything we've spoken about in this episode. And I just want to say thank you so much for being a guest on The Only Constant. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for the wonderful discussion. It's a great opportunity to be here. Thank you.
You've listened to The Only Constant, a podcast sponsored by Basico.